Welcome to this video on chunking and scanning sentences in Greek. These are two of the three techniques of sorting out sentences in Greek that I present in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. In other videos, I'll demonstrate the more detailed technique of sentence mapping. These first two techniques are useful when you hit a sentence that's difficult to read. As your fluency in Greek increases, then obviously there will be less need for chunking or scanning. Both chunking and scanning can be done either in a printed copy of a passage or a digital copy. If you're going to work with a digital copy, or if you want to print a copy to mark by hand, then the first step is obviously to get a copy of the passage. If you have a program like BibleWorks, Logos, or Accordance, you can easily copy and paste text to a document in your word processing program. If you don't have such a program, then there are copies of the Greek New Testament available on the web. If you want to download a copy of the whole Greek New Testament, one good option is available on the website for Tyndale House, the Library for Biblical Research in Cambridge, England. Here you see several options for both Hebrew and Greek Bibles. For our purposes, we'll choose Greek New Testament with accents. Clicking on that link downloads a zip file of the Greek New Testament, and once you unzip the file, then you'll have the Greek New Testament as a single document. Here you see the first page of the document. To find the passage you want to study, you can click on the highlighted title on the left and then scroll through the whole book, or you can use the abbreviation on the right to go to the chapter you want. One of our examples will be from Acts 14. So to get to Acts 14, you do a search using Control F or whatever search command your word processing program uses, and search for Act 14. That will take you to the beginning of the chapter. You can scroll through until you find the verses you want, and then highlight that and copy it and paste it into your word processing program. Another option is the SBL Greek New Testament. You can search for that on the web or go to the address you see there on the screen. It's not easy to navigate around this New Testament as a doc or PDF file. If you have Logos, then you may already have a copy. Otherwise, you can use BibleHub.com. So here you see the home page for BibleHub.com. We'll use James 1 verses 2 to 4 as our first example. So let's see how we get a copy of that. In the text box at the top of the page, you can type in the chapter you're going to search, and that'll take you to an English translation. But if you click on Greek and then scroll through there, you'll see a number of editions of the Greek New Testament, but click on Additional Parallel Greek, and the SBL Greek New Testament should be the first thing you see. And so again, you can just copy and paste that. So now we have our passage. Let's see how to chunk it. In chunking a text, we simply mark off various sense units. Often you'll have to sort out the parsings and other points of grammar as you're chunking or scanning. The punctuation already provides divisions, and then you can add further divisions in as much detail as you find helpful. You can use a vertical line to separate the sense units, or give each unit its own line in a digital copy. Here the chunking simply follows the punctuation. Here's the same analysis using separate lines. Notice the punctuation at the end of each line. This passage is simple enough that this level may clarify things, but if not, then you can break it down further. Verse 3 looks like a long line, so let's see what we can do with that. Here you see that I've marked off the participle at the beginning, and then the conjunction hoti, and then the main units within the hoti clause. So this would be one way to chunk this text. For a more complex sentence, let's look at Acts 14:13. This passage has no punctuation to help us, and it has a couple of participles and several prepositions. So let's see what we can do with it. In this chunking, I've simply separated out the participles, ontos and anenkos, and the prepositional phrases beginning with pra, epi, and soon. Here's the same analysis with vertical lines. In this case, the chunking shows us units to work with, but leaves a lot of questions as to how the units fit together. So let's move on to scanning a passage. Scanning marks a passage with more precision. So you can use a vertical line to separate clauses, put brackets around verbal clusters within clauses. For particularly complex clauses, you can use angle brackets to set off clausal units within the larger clauses, and use parentheses around prepositional phrases, adjectival participles, and other clusters of words you might find it helpful to mark. You may also want to double underline finite verbs. These will usually be at the heart of the clauses, and single underline the other verbs, in other words, the infinitives and participles. These will usually be at the heart of verbal clusters within clauses. So the first step is to sort out the clauses. The start of each new verse will usually be the start of a new clause, and punctuation can help. Periods, question marks, and raised dots separate clauses. Commas may separate clauses, or they may not. Since clauses usually have a finite verb at their core, then paying attention to the finite verbs will help you sort out clauses. So you can begin by double underlining the finite verbs and single underlining the infinitives and participles. Conjunctions often initiate clauses, so watch for them. So all these signals will help you identify clauses, and once you've identified them, then you can put vertical lines between them. Then you start examining what you have within each clause. You can use square brackets to mark the verbal clusters within clauses, paying special attention to adverbial participles and adverbial infinitives. And here you see we have two participles. Then you can move on to the prepositional phrases and put those in parentheses, along with adjectival participles and other units you may find helpful. And among the other clusters you might put in parentheses, I've marked here the vocative in verse 2. So there's a scanning of James 1, 2-4. Now let's scan Acts 14:13. In this case we only have one verse, so we won't look for verse numbers to help us, and there's no punctuation, so we move right on to the verbs. And this sentence only has one finite verb, and two participles, and one infinitive. Since there's only one finite verb, this verse is all one long clause, so we don't need any vertical lines. So we move right along to mark verbal clusters, and we find two of them around each of the participles. One of them's an adverbial participle, so we put square brackets around it. These clauses are not very complex, so we don't need angle brackets, so we can move right on to the items to put in parentheses. The first item I have in a parenthesis here is an adjectival participle. Now as an alternative you could use square brackets for all participles and infinitives and their clusters, but here I'll use parentheses since this is functioning adjectively. The other thing to mark with parentheses are the prepositional phrases, and we find three of those. So our scanning has highlighted the large structures in this sentence. Let's walk through it now to see what we have. This nominative is our subject. Don't be fooled by the accent on ha. That is a definite article, but the accent's due to the following enclitic te. Ha hierus is our subject, the priest. Now we have a genitive modifying that subject, and this is an irregular noun. Its nominative form is Zeus, but then the genitive dios and the accusative dia. Then we come to our first participle cluster. This articular participle from me modifies dios since it's in agreement with it. Both are genitives, and the articles help you see that. The prepositional phrase is the complement to the participle. So we'd have something like which was before or at the entrance to the city. So the whole thing would be the Zeus which was at the entrance to the city, and that would be a reference to the temple of Zeus. Now we have our second participle cluster. These accusatives, taurus and stemata, are the direct objects of the participle enenkos. Enenkos is an aorist from the verb pharaoh. Pharaoh is one of the 10 verbs used in the New Testament that has multiple roots for its principal parts. This aorist is a kappa aorist, and such verbs leave out a sigma. So the nominative masculine singular would normally be sas, but here in this kappa aorist it's just the os ending. The prepositional phrase within this cluster modifies the participle, so we'd have something like having brought bulls and wreaths to the gates. Now we finally get to our main verb and its complementary infinitive and prepositional phrase. So he wanted to sacrifice with the crowds. So one translation of this verse could be, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was before the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the gates and wanted to sacrifice with the crowds. Having sorted out the details of the sentence, the scan helps you read and reread the passage, and you can try to pick up the sense in the Greek order and understand the meaning of the words instead of translating it into English. So here's a summary of what we've seen in this video. Chunking uses vertical lines or separate lines of text to highlight clusters of words in a sentence. Scanning marks clauses, verbal clusters, prepositional phrases, and other word clusters with a series of marks. And these techniques can be done on either hard copy or digital copies of text. Once you've marked a passage, you should reread it multiple times to familiarize yourself with the flow of the Greek, and then continue to read it without the marked copy. Chunking and scanning are useful at times when you're reading through passages. You can mark your whole passage or just a few marks here and there to help make sense out of difficult bits. These techniques don't sort out all the issues that can arise in the flow of Greek sentences. For greater precision, you can then map a sentence or a whole passage. Using and enjoying Biblical Greek provides extensive guidance for doing maps, and I've posted videos to introduce the main features of this further technique. So between chunking, scanning, and mapping, you have several different techniques or tools to help you make sense out of sentences.